Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Fraunfelter with Institute for the Future. This is the second in a series that we are having a weekly series of interviews with people who are doing work in online collaboration. Last week we had Howard Rheingold, and you can hear that conversation by visiting Institute for the Future. I think it's called the iftf.org/online collaboration series. If I didn't get that URL right, Julie will add it to the notes. And this week, I'm really excited to have Bob Johansen on this program. And Bob's been with Institute for the Future since tell me, Bob, when did you start at IFTF?
1973.
1973. So you've been there for quite a while, and you've done a lot of research into online collaboration, and in fact, some really interesting stuff about teleconferencing and social media since the early 70s. And I thought maybe we could start just by you taking us back to that time and telling us a little bit about what you learned.
Great. Thanks a lot, and welcome everybody, and glad to have this conversation. I'm going to try to look back, but mostly look forward, and especially look today to what are the lessons we can learn from the past experience, and also our forecasts of where all this is going. So when I joined Institute for the Future in 1973, I worked on a team led by Jacques Vallée, who I hope is listening in now, and Jacques going to be doing one of these soon. Jacques was the leader of this team, and our responsibility was to build a prototype system, a prototype for scientists linking with each other. And in those days, before the internet, it was called the ARPANET, and only defense contractors could use it. And it was basically for data exchange, not for people communicating with people. So Jacques' team brought this really foreign idea of people communicating with people through computers. And the research reports we did then on Jacques' team was a series of reports called Group Communication Through Computers. And it's really important to note, when the ARPANET began, this was viewed, people communicating with computers, that was viewed as a misuse of CPU. it was not what it was designed to do. It was designed for data exchange. And Jacques brought this very adventuresome idea, and he had been previously in Doug Engelbart's lab, but he brought this idea of people communicating through the network. And it raised the issue, the really big issue that we still face, of which medium is good for what. You know, how do we make media choices? And that's the challenge we came out of. And then the Institute followed that path from the early 70s, doing a prototype system of what we now call social media or collaborative media like Slack. And following that, always with an eye 10 years ahead, into the world of teleconferencing, office automation, groupware, machine learning, non-human participants. So we've been always thinking about 10 years ahead as that process moves. But it really is something that's rooted in this early 70s version of the internet, which was publicly introduced in 72.
And you, in our earlier discussions about this, you came to some interesting observations about online collaboration. One of them was about video versus audio. You were very involved very early in teleconferencing experiments and learned quite a bit from that about things that apply today and will
Yeah,
extend till tomorrow probably as well.
yeah. And again, this was kind of a foreign idea then, because audio conferencing was just getting going and video conferencing was getting going at the same time as this ability to do text conferencing, you know, what we used to call computer conferencing or teleconferencing, what we now call social media or collaborative media. And along the way, there was a temporary term called groupware that was used. But that whole idea of framing it as a range of media options, that was a really different idea. And what we learned through that, there's a classic article from that period called, is video valuable or is audio adequate? And the conclusion from laboratory tests was that the most vital medium is audio. Video is nice to have, and it adds something, definitely, to kind of give context and give a sense of the more qualitative side. But if you don't have good audio, you don't have anything. You don't have anything. And in the design of systems, there's been a trap all the way along, and it still continues to view face to face as the ideal medium and to make as if we're just creating digital substitutions for face to face meetings. And indeed, there was a time when the term travel telecommunication substitution was popular. And that's obviously not going to happen, because when people, David Peskovitz likes to say, the more digital we become, the more we value in person. And I think that's been true all the way along. Face-to-face is great for certain things, but it's not enough. There's actually some things we can do digitally that we can't do in person. For example, in person, we can only talk one at a time. And we have to have a meeting space, and we're limited by physical appearances. Where in virtual media, you can do different things. But the key thing is audio is really important. And just as a quick example of that, there's research on the detection of lying. And that research has found that it's easier to detect if someone else is lying through audio only than it is through audio, video, or in person. And that's really an interesting finding to me. And it makes perfect sense in my experience. If you think of people that you've seen who are very good liars, they tend to do that with their hands or with their appearance or with their visual cues. That's what magicians do. But audio only, we have this inherent ability to filter, but it's got to be really good audio. So my recommendation is, if you have limited bandwidth, invest it in audio first and get great audio. I'd love to see binaural audio, spatial audio, high def audio, and then video is great, and it's kind of a nice plus. But everything builds on audio, and that's just not assumed. So in virtual meetings, now that we're all meeting virtually, I was in a meeting last week where I was presenting to a group in Brussels, and the audio was awful. The audio was awful. There's no excuse for that anymore.
Yeah, there's no excuse for it, but it becomes more and more common. And I think as part of this everywhere, every time demand that's being placed on people, so are in with a hormone can do a conference call,
Right.
and it's the weak link in the chain that ruins the conversation for everybody if one person has bad audio.
Exactly. And especially if a leader has bad audio, like what you're doing right now, Mark. You've got a high quality microphone and you've got muffled headsets. I'm working off my MacBook Pro. I want to get a microphone like what you have, and the MacBook Pro is a lot better than it used to be, but we all have to struggle with good audio.
Yeah, well, and it is your audio is actually really good, and that's improved a lot. So there
It
is
has.
progress being made in some ways. Um, can you talk a little bit more about binaural audio and what that might add to conversations?
Yeah, I love this idea, and I've heard it in prototype, but it's very rare in practice. But it's basically spatial audio. So one of the big issues in audio is speaker identification. Who's talking at a given time. But if I was in a meeting with you and 10 other people, your voice might come from this side of my brain as I hear it. And Marina Gorbis's voice might come from over here, and Jacques Vallée's voice would come from up here. So even if I didn't pick up the speaker identification, I'd know it spatially. And you can do that if you do the audio right. It's hard and it takes a lot of bandwidth. And I'm not saying audio is easy. It's really tough. I'm just saying
Yeah.
we got to think about it and get the best audio we can, and think about audio first and then think about video. Instead of today, designers and users tend to think about video first and then audio.
Right. Yeah, that makes a big difference. And I like that idea of creating that sense of space in your head so that um, that kind of 3D experience of having people around you is really going to add a lot to
Oh,
being able to
yeah.
have a conversation.
Yeah. Really, really important.
You
Uh,
know, without
so
visuals, I think is really a
So,
cool
so
thing.
I wanted to just show a couple of things, and we're going to put these references up. But this is the book that Jacques Vallée and Kathy Vian and I did, 1978, called Electronic Meetings, and it summarizes in the back all of the literature of which medium is good for what. And it also has a simulation game that we designed that allowed people to play the game over different media to try to help decide which medium is good for what. And we get it with the game designer, Gary Schertz. And then Jacques left the Institute and founded a company to take these ideas and make them practical and scale them. This book was written 5 years later in the McGraw-Hill Data Communication series. And it does a really nice job of handling that transition from the research we were doing with very early prototypes to what does that mean when you actually try to turn it into a product or a service. But we'll give you all the links to this. So if you really want to go back into the history, you'll be able to do that.
Yeah. Um, let's talk a little bit about some of the work that you reported in your book, The New Leadership Literacies. Um, in one of the chapters, you came up with a matrix that is
Yes,
really interesting. And maybe we could talk about that matrix because I think this is kind of key to a lot of
great.
what's going on today.
Great. And this matrix, the first one we did, first version of it was in this book, which was called Groupware in 1988. And this, by the way, is dedicated to Jacques Vallée and Doug Engelbart. And the inscription says, to two early pioneers of groupware before it was called that. And it's very interesting because we don't even use the word groupware anymore
Hmm.
because we assume that's just what our computers do. So oftentimes these terms, when we're studying at Institute for the Future, these blobs on the horizon, we give them temporary names. And then if they succeed, the name disappears because it just becomes part of the fabric. So the first version of this, what was originally a matrix, was in this form. But here's the later version, which the first version was literally a matrix. And I was frustrated because I wanted it to be more organic and less symmetrical, less boxy, because these media aren't discrete. They kind of blend into each other. But these are the basic options. And can you see my pointer here, Mark?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, cool. Okay, so same time, same place is in person. And the research is summarized here and in the book, The New Leadership Literacies. I've got much more detail on that and references. But same time, same place, in-person meetings. They're best for orientation, trust building, and renewal. They will not go away. The research on this, and it's a long stream of research, the research suggests that as long as people have the option for getting together in person, they really like to do that. So the new media don't replace the old media. They create this blend of alternative media, which is going to get much, much better over the next decade. So face-to-face is not going to go away, but in times like we're in right now, extreme stress times, and this isn't the first, we just aren't allowed to travel. So that's same time, same place. The other extreme is different times, different places, asynchronous. Best for implementation and coordination. That's what we call today social media or collaborative media. Then over here on the lower left, same time, different places. That's best when quick feedback is needed, but meeting a person is difficult. So that's things like screen sharing, like what we're doing now with Zoom, like FaceTime. And then up here in the upper right, different time, same place. Best when central physical space is required. So for example, we did a custom forecast recently for Walmart on sort of digital media and digital shopping. And a Walmart distribution center or a Walmart store, those are the same place, but they're used by different people at different times. And then, of course, now most of the action is anytime, any place, the smartphone and all the things made possible with that. And Toshi Hu in the Institute's lab, he's looking at this next generation of cross reality, blended reality, anytime, any place. So the smartphone is just kind of a crude prototype of where that's going to be 10 years from now. And of course, if you think about this, if you're 24 or less, what we call the true digital natives, or if you're 15 or less, what Toshi calls the XR natives, you're going to be better at any time, any place. If you're more than 24, you're probably going to be better at in-person meetings. And most leaders I know today are great in person, but they degrade when they get into a virtual situation. And that's why you have to have a presence, even if you're not there physically. And there's a great cross-generational learning opportunity here, because if you're more than 24, you're better at in person. But if you're less than 24, you're better at everything else. Everything else. So it's a great cross-generational learning opportunity. And so many adults and parents and grandparents, they kind of blame the kids for the lack of social skill instead of saying, hey, this is a cross-generational learning opportunity. I want to learn from you. And I think I've got something that I can share with you as well. So let me stop the sharing. But this is what used to be a matrix and what is now this kind of flow of media options. And the challenge is we all got to get really good at choosing which medium is good for what.
I want to talk a little bit about that same time, same place. And you said it's great for renewal, trust building, those kinds of things. But
And
it's obvious
orientation. Right.
For the next, for the foreseeable future, this is not going to be an option for a lot of organizations. What can they do to mitigate that problem?
Right. So you're at a big advantage if you have shared values. So you're essentially look for what you have in common. And in-person meetings are best for orientation, trust building, and renewal because they give you time to get the context. So if you're on a new team and it's an international team and you get together in person, I like to get together with people in their homes, meet their families, get a whole sense of what their lives are like. Now, we can't do that now. So that works. Orientation and trust building works better if you can share values and look for what you have in common and then build on what you have in common. And then it requires great facilitation. So you've got to have a really good facilitator who brings everybody into the conversation. I had a Zoom meeting yesterday with 10 CEOs in the energy industry, run by a group called CEO Net. And they had a wonderful facilitator, Brenda Curio. And Brenda brought everybody into the conversation. We were all doing it from her home. So she had us do little tours like, this is my home study. And you can see the bookshelves. And I've got my exercise equipment here. And it's the place where I'm most comfortable anywhere in the world. And I'm probably smarter in my study than anywhere else. And we each shared kind of our personal background. And this was a 3-hour meeting, but she gave us bioempathy permission to leave whenever we felt we needed to, just turn off our cameras and come back. And it was amazing. In 3 hours, I felt like I knew all those people quite well, even though I only knew Brenda and one of the CEOs before. But I think it's possible. And here's where I think video does add something, especially a video in your home, because you can give a home. And in one case, a dog came into the room and that kind of broke the ice. And all of us should share our pets, as part of the orientation and trust building process. So I agree it's harder. It's easier if you have shared values. And if you can build on those shared values, you can do a lot. This is the thing I love to communicate with any of you who were not doing what Jacques and I were doing in the 70s. It's so much better than it used to be. These awful video conferencing systems of the 70s were so crude and so backward. This is really quite good.
Yeah. And I'm actually really excited about the future with AR and VR. And I've been watching my 16-year-old daughter use VR chat as a way to collaborate with people. She plays accordion. And so she was on VR chat. She found out someone else was a guitar player. And they ended up having like a jam session. And she has no idea this person could be on another continent somewhere. And they had a guitar accordion jam session using VR chat. I thought it was so cool.
I think that's wonderful. And yeah, Yo-Yo Ma just began this week a process of sharing that comfort music around the world. And I've got a friend who is one of the Walmart executives, and he's got his daughters at colleges all around the country, or at least they were. But while they were at college, he used Quest. He bought them all Oculus Quest for Christmas, and they have Friday movie night, and they watch movies together through Oculus Quest. And so it's an informal kind of ambient experience to keep the family together.
I'm starting to see this use of collaborative software as a way for people to connect in new ways because of this
Yeah,
kind of isolation we're experiencing. Netflix
right.
now has a plug-in so that people in separate households can watch movies together and comment on them. Um, there's this guy Mo Willems who is a children's book illustrator who's now doing a lunchtime sketching series where he has a live video and he
Nice,
brings out his tools. He
nice.
encourages other people to sketch with him. Um, uh, I'm seeing a lot of these kinds of just turn on the camera and let's kind of share
Yes.
what we're doing in a more ambient way. There's an app that Ari Gentry told me about where you can like buddy up with another person by video, and it's kind of like randomly selected, and you just kind of work together. It's co-working, you're working on your own separate projects. You don't even know that person, but just the fact that you are kind of in a space with another
Yes.
person increases your productivity. You're not even like talking to the other person. It's pretty
That's
amazing.
definitely right. And this raises a really important point, Mark. I did my PhD at Northwestern, and I was based in a sociology department. And I was taught how to do research where you identify an independent variable. And then you say, well, what are the impacts on that independent variable on a series of dependent variables? That's the way
Mhm.
sociologists traditionally do research. So I started studying new media on Jacques' team and tried to apply the same thing and said, well, what about video conferencing? What about text-based conferencing? What about in person? And I realized those are not clean, independent variables. You can't just say, how good is video conferencing? You can't even say, how good is Zoom? You have to say, what are the range of possible uses? And it all comes back to the facilitator. If the facilitator plans and organizes the meeting, it's going to be much more effective. I think facilitation is even more important for virtual media than it is for physical when you don't have the same clues. But I think that's a big deal because you can't just say video is good for this, audio is good for that. It's just not a good independent variable. So much of it depends on your skill in using it.
And I think this is the time for people to apply their skills, and that we are just at the very beginning of this online collaboration kind of uh, revolution. People are going
Yeah,
to discover things. We're just starting to see just glimmers of what's going to happen, and it's really exciting. I
yeah,
feel like we've just been in this incubation period for a long time, and now that we're
yeah.
forced to take action, we're going
Yeah,
to see
I
some cool
agree.
stuff.
I agree. This is a great opportunity for innovation in how we use these media. And fortunately, the media are so much better. My big concern now is that the internet holds up for this. And
Hmm.
I'm told, I've been asking my engineer friends, how long can we go on meeting like this? And they did say that Zoom is very efficient in terms of its bandwidth requirements, and that's really helpful. But I've been having 3 or 4 Zoom calls a day from my home setup, and I think what we're learning is the art of communicating through these virtual media. And I agree, we're going to get much better. The way I like to view the internet, people tend to say, oh, the internet's kind of old news. But I think everything that's happened now, and the internet was started in 1968 and publicly introduced in 72. The World Wide Web didn't take off till the early 90s. So you think, well, this is a mature technology. I don't think that at all. I think what's happened so far from 1968 up to now is the world's largest market test for what's about to happen next. And we get to create it. We get to create it. And a lot of it's going to be, now that the technology is good enough, we got to figure out how to use it in really wonderful, really humane, really productive ways.
Yeah, I think so. And that's one of the things that I'm interested in doing is just continuing to capture signals of
Yeah.
what people are doing with
Yes.
this because it's a it's a scary time, but it's also really exciting seeing
Yeah.
people come together.
Yeah, I agree. And let's put some of those signals in the links after this meeting. And let's add the Yo-Yo Ma, which just began this week. He
Hmm.
just started it 3 days ago. But he's recruiting signals of people using music to calm each other in these stressful times.
Yeah, I also was reading about how because South by Southwest was canceled, a lot of the clubs that were expecting
Yeah,
packed houses and they had booked all these great musicians to
nice.
come, the club owners are now organizing these kinds of house concerts where the
Nice.
musicians play in their own house or on their front porch. And
Nice.
the most recent one, 5,000 people watched a performer live play from his
Wow.
house
Nice.
and filled his tip jar with
Nice.
contributions. Pretty cool stuff happening.
Very cool.
Yeah. Um, one thing that I wanted to just briefly touch on is that we, in this time, we also should be careful about what you wrote in your book. Blended reality leadership presence could become Big Brother incarnate, with performance monitoring turning into eavesdropping, measuring stress levels and emotional states, and cataloging worker output on a minute by minute basis. That's something that we do need to be aware of.
Yes, yes. And um, so that's becoming practical too, in unfortunate ways. And just to go back to Jacques Vallée's team, when I first joined, um, Jacques had an idea when we had these collaborative systems, we call them computer conference. What would it be like if you had a group of people on a team in a group, but you also had a non-human participant? And we had a genius programmer that Jacques worked with, Hubert Lipinski, who created this system called Hub that was a prototype AI persona that could live in a computer conference. Now that's really interesting concept, and it was way ahead of its time. But now you can see another signal we use at the Institute now is the venture capital firm in Hong Kong that actually has an AI program that's on the board of directors. And it's not making decisions, it's there to test other decisions. But they actually have a seat at the table, a kind of Elijah seat for the AI program at board meetings. So I think that is becoming possible. And in this book that you referenced earlier, The New Leadership Literacies, I worked with our colleague at the Institute, Ben Hamamoto, to do a case study of Miku, who is the crowdsourced cyber entertainment phenomenon in Japan that is a completely virtual celebrity. So it's crowdsourced though. So all of her music, all of her dance steps are created by the crowd, and she embodies what that crowd is. And what I'm speculating about, and I've got a whole chapter and a whole scenario in here that talks about what could happen if you have a Miku-like assistant or associate of a CEO or a top leader. So Marina Gorbis likes to ask the question, what do humans do best? What do computers do best? And over the next decade, we're going to have a good answer to that question. And if we think of Miku as a prototype for that and ask, what is it that we want computers to do as non-human participants, but what is it that we don't want? And there's a fascinating concept that I talk about in the book from robotics called the uncanny valley. And we want these agents, these non-human agents, to perform more and more like humans until we get to a certain point. And then we hit the uncanny valley,
Hmm.
where it's just weird. It's not human, but it's weird.
And creepy.
And what we need there, and that's your point, Mark, is we need something that responds to our needs and does things that we can't do. And yet it doesn't, it's going to be too much. We're going to have the ability, we're going to have sensors everywhere a decade from now, very cheap sensors, a lot of them connected, some of them in our bodies. It's going to be great for a leader to have a sense of how people are doing, just from a health and well-being point of view. But when I meet with the person I report to in the morning, and that person already knows how well I slept the night before, that's the uncanny valley. That's too close. So I think over the next decade, we're going to reach that threshold of choice, the uncanny valley, if you will. And we've got to figure out how to answer that question of what do computers do best and what do humans do best. It's getting a lot better over the next decade. The tools are very exciting. But there's going to be some hard choices that we face because some of these things are going to get too close.
Hmm. Yeah, and it will get to be very uncanny, as you said. One of a kind of cool basic example of uh, a presence that's non-human in a group discussion is on a Discord server. Sometimes people will use a chatbot as one of the participants, and they're just kind
Yes,
of monitoring the conversation. If someone asks a frequently asked question, the chatbot will come in and answer that question, so that the
right,
leaders of the group don't have to cut and paste the answer in there, just automatically done, which I think is
right.
a great use,
It,
offloading
it,
stuff that,
it could be as long as it fits in context.
sure.
Right. You remember the earliest AI programs were modeled on Rogerian therapy, where they're basically responding to a question, what of with I hear you saying, and kind of developing kind of
Yeah.
they sound like they're realistic, but they're really not, and that gets into the uncanny valley, as well.
Yeah. Are you referring to the Eliza?
Eliza was the first, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about your mother. Yeah. um, I just wanted to let the folks who are in listening to this and watching this with us, that if you'd like to ask questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we would encourage you to ask questions if you have one that you'd like Bob to answer. That would be completely welcome. So, Bob, one of the things that I would like to talk about is your kind of thoughts on AR and VR as a just moving into the future a little bit. Have you come across interesting signals using AR and VR for online collaboration that are exciting to you?
Yeah, definitely. So Toshi, who I mentioned earlier, and Susanna Forsheimer at the Institute are, my primary window into that world. And they're the ones who showed me the Oculus Quest. And I do think the Quest could be a signal product, signal experience for blended reality. And my instinct about this is that the completely immersive virtual reality is going to be very important for certain specialized cases. But the really powerful medium is going to be blended reality and augmented reality. So the way I'm seeing things 10 years out, now we have these crude smartphones and tablets and laptops. 10 years out, it's going to be much more graceful of an interface, that'll be always on unless we choose for it to be off. And
Mhm.
I'm expecting 10 years from now, it's going to be built into my glasses, and there's going to be some kind of bone conductor
Mhm.
audio that's going to be very good. And I'm going to have that ability to filter as I walk, to filter experience. And I call these in the new book, the Full Spectrum Thinking book, I call these clarity filters, because the world's getting so complicated that we need filters for everything that kind of put things in context. And the tools for that over the next decade are going to get so much more graceful. But what I'm personally looking forward to is that more blended reality, the ability to filter when we want it. And and we choose when we don't. But that ability, to me, that's where the most powerful impact is. And that gives us a lot more skills for collaboration too, because we'll know the links and be able to draw the links we want to draw, but avoid those that we don't.
Hmm. How might we be having this kind of discussion with an audience 10 years from now?
um, I think we look for hints, for signals. I remember Marina Gorbis shared with me some years ago the virtual choir, the signal, which began of people creating a choir of people from all around the world who sang together. Um, that's a really interesting signal. And now the Yo-Yo Ma groups and the people singing and playing instruments from the balconies in Italy, those are interesting signals of how we might work together. So I think in terms of collaboration, it goes back to what do we have in common and what do we like to share, and the meaning that that communication provides.
Hmm.
Because I think work is a very important source of meaning, and there's going to be new spectrums of meaning that come out of these kinds of interactions. So I think you're going to see blended reality opportunities to meet together that are going to be more gracefully blended with in-person and virtual. And sometimes it's going to be hard to tell the difference. Our friends at Procter & Gamble are now using the term fusion commerce instead of in-store or online shopping. That distinction, sort of online shopping, not going to make any sense 10 years from now. In effect, we'll always be shopping, but there'll be times like we're experiencing now when we can't go outside. And unfortunately, it's likely we're going to have more of those, not less. So we're going to have to make smarter decisions about which medium is good for what. And the good news is the media are getting so much better, so much cheaper, that we're going to have many more options. But all of them are going to require human skill in how to use them, because this is not a technology we're using, it's a medium.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, the name of one of the Institute reports Rod Falcon did a while back, and Brad Crichton in our group, was when everything is media. And we're hitting that now, when everything is media.
Yeah. And I think with technology powering these, like 5G technology, uh,
Yes.
the media and everything becomes media. The only reason that we are having to sit here now is because the technology we're using, this microphone, the computer I have, forcing me to sit in a seat. Would be great.
Yep.
I would be able to have this conversation with you while walking along the fire trail here in the Hollywood Hills. Um,
Yeah.
that would be like a great thing to be able to do.
Well, we all heard Howard Rheingold in the first in the series, and Howard lives up in the hills, and he loves to have walking meetings. He goes
Yeah.
out and walks with people, and I love walking meetings too. So if those were blended reality walking meetings, and it's interesting that this morning in the New York Times, there's a wonderful piece about walking in New York, even in the coronavirus period, and all the doctors are suggesting get outside and walk if you're allowed to, just stay away from people.
Hmm.
So you can do physical distancing, but getting outside is really important for all of our mental health. And even here in the Bay Area now, we are allowed to walk our dogs, and we are allowed to get outside for exercise as long as we stay 6 feet away from people. So I think
Yeah.
we need those abilities, and it's not an either or world, it's a both and world. And I think that kind of outdoors activity it's so important to us as human beings. But we're always going to be having these resources with us if we want them. And those
Hmm.
resources are going to get so much more graceful.
Yeah. I agree. There's a question from Todd, and his question is: Fusion commerce, is it the same as omni-channel experience?
Great question, Todd. Yeah, he knows his stuff. So omnichannel is the word that used to be used for fusion commerce, which most people aren't using yet. So
Hmm.
as usual, we're kind of in the gap. between the words that are going away and the words that are coming in. I don't know if fusion commerce is going to take off or not. I find it a little awkward, actually. But I like the idea. And the point of it is we now tend to think in terms of either in-store shopping or online. And with fusion commerce, it doesn't make any sense to distinguish them. So the summary for the next decade, it's a world of and, not or,
Hmm.
not or. And a lot of these distinctions, these either or distinctions, they're just not going to make sense in this context. And what media do at their best is they blend together that capability. And in person is just one in this full spectrum of media that we need to make choices over. And again, face-to-face is not the ideal. You know, face-to-face has real limitations, like you can catch the coronavirus if you face-to-face. You can't catch it through this medium. So I don't think. It is a novel virus. But we have to figure out what each medium is good for what, and then decide how we use it best. So we make smart choices. And then after we choose it, we have to choose how we can have a presence. So as leaders, we need to be there when we're not there. And when we're not there, we need to be even better than when we are.
Hmm. Can you just give me a quick example of fusion commerce?
Um, sure. Fusion commerce would be the ability, if you're in a store and you see a particular item and you pull up your smartphone and you overlay it and say, what are the features of that, or who recommends that, or how could I buy that online if not? So that's kind of an early example of
Hmm.
it, where you're in a store. And another example would be, I think what's going to happen with stores is they're going to become experience zones. So anything that's routine will be ordered online, or maybe even ordered automatically. But the experience could be health related or beauty related or exercise related. The experience is going to be what you do in person. But when you're in person, you're also going to have virtual filters and virtual aids there with you. And that fusion is what we're talking about. And to state it crudely, we're always shopping, or we always could potentially be shopping. And the process, the act of shopping, is going to be much more built into the way we live. That's why it's called fusion. And again, it's an awkward term, but that's what it means. It's that
Hmm.
blending of in-person and virtual experiences in the interest of commerce.
Okay, that makes sense. I had that experience where I went to the Apple store, checked out all the different iPhone models, thought about it, came home a few days later, picked the iPhone that I wanted to get for my wife for her birthday, and then picked the 2-hour delivery from the local Apple store, and it was delivered
Interesting,
to me.
interesting,
Yeah, so I could see, yeah, the
interesting.
Apple
So that would
store
be
is,
a simple example of that.
yeah.
And here, there are definitely dangers of this, where again, it gets more like a big brother-ish thing, and we're always
Hmm.
being advertised to. And that's the awful side of that. You don't want it to be always on. If you don't want it on, you don't want to be always pushing product at you, unless it's just the right product at just the right time, and then it feels really good. So this is a very delicate balance, a delicate dance uh, between the products and the people who use the products, and the experience which is in the middle. But if another rule of our thumb as forecasters, rules of thumb, is that almost nothing is truly new, and really big changes usually take 30 to 50 years to be an overnight success. And that's why we always look back. Usually, if we're doing a 10-year forecast, we'll look 50 years back.
Hmm.
Um, and if you look at this area of fusion commerce, Joe Pine and Jim Gilmore wrote a book called The Experience Economy more than 30 years ago, and it came out just recently in a new edition. And what they argue is it's going to be harder and harder and harder to make any money selling products alone. You're going to have to sell services, experiences, personal transformations, or organizational transformations. And they were right. They were just 30 years too
Hmm.
early.
Hmm.
And now that's becoming practical, and you can have that experience economy in a much more useful way than was ever possible before. But
Hmm.
that's the idea of fusion commerce, and it comes with all these delicacies.
Hmm. That's interesting. So it's kind of thinking of companies are platforms that include products rather than just making the products and selling
That's
them.
right. I mean, products are still important and quality is still very important, but it's more of a price of entry. And once you have a good product, the margins on that are going to be driven down by online access.
Hmm.
But the margins will grow as you get more into services and experiences and the human experiences that can be provided in addition to the product itself. Now, I
Hmm.
think we should also do a footnote here, linked to the uncanny valley and the dangers of fusion commerce, about asynchronous media, the kind of store and forward, like right now we're using email or Slack or some asynchronous, different times, different places media. Um, the potential for misunderstanding in those media, especially in a crisis period like this, and the neuroscience of what we're all going through during this crisis.
Hmm.
So, for example, when Jacques and I were first looking at this notion of text messaging through the ARPANET, IBM was doing prototypes of that. And IBM, in their first versions of it, actually put delays in their message. So you could send a message, but it wouldn't be delivered till hours later because they were concerned that people would say things they didn't really mean and would offend other people.
So they could pull
So
it back.
they gave you a chance to pull the message back. It's what
Hmm.
started to be called flaming, flaming
Hmm.
emails. Um, and and now we're more subtle than that, and we never put up with that. But it's still possible, and I feel this myself at times in this kind of period when we're all working alone, and you send an email and you get one back that's kind of icy or kind of uptight or a little brittle. We're all brittle in response.
Hmm.
So I think the challenge in these media where you can't get immediate feedback and kind of support each other, um, you can throw these little time bombs, and you're not sure what happens when they explode and get received on the other side. So I think we all have to be very empathetic in this period. I remember in the early days on the ARPANET, the network was very slow. And we proved over and over again that people get frustrated when the computer crashes.
Hmm.
But I would actually try to play back my messages before I sent them, just so I could kind of imagine how they might be received on the other end, particularly in a new medium and people in other countries. But I think we all need to develop that sense of empathy with how people perceive us in person, but especially how they perceive messages we send asynchronously.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Okay, we have a question here. This is from an anonymous attendee. Excuse me. IFTF has been very focused on distributed networks with focus on the positive potential for humanity. The past few years, we've seen the unintended consequences of communications networks, disinformation, isolation, addiction, surveillance. Right now, we're seeing some of the unintended consequences of the globalized physical connectivity. We're becoming aware of the flow of people, goods, and money in a whole new light in this pandemic. What do you think
Yes.
we're learning about a globally networked world that we maybe didn't fully anticipate about this globalized world as we have been building it? And how might we need to transform our vision of the future of globalization?
Yeah. Wow.
It's,
Great question.
yeah, that's a really good one.
So I think you're right. I think we underestimated the negative impacts. And I think we are, at least speak for me personally, I'm a hopeful guy. But I've also been doing this more than 30 years now. And this is the most frightening 10-year forecast I've ever done. And it's the most hopeful I've ever done. And I've been saying that for the last 5 years. So it's like the stakes have been going up. And I do think we have to focus on those threats and the really bad things that have happened as the result of all this connectivity. We have a lab now, the DigIntelligence Lab, and Dick Milo and other people in our group who have been thinking through this. Jane McGonigal and Sam Woolley did a ethical OS kind of analysis to help people design new systems in ways that can avoid those problems. So I think you're exactly right. That's a very big concern. I think what we're trying to balance, we're an independent nonprofit, we're not selling this technology, but we are trying to make the future a better place. We're trying to figure out what are the ways we can use these media in positive ways. But a lot of these media can be used for good and they can be used for evil. And unfortunately, in many cases, I study shape-shifting organizations, I call them. And the criminals and the terrorists are better at shape-shifting than the rest of us. So we have to learn for them, but we certainly don't want to do what they're doing. We want to make the future a better place.
Yeah. Let's see. I think we can ask another question here. This one is Bob from Todd. Bob, have you done any research or aware of any that you like about creating swift trust or the antecedents of trust in online collaboration settings? Very interested in any recommendations you may have.
Wow, that's such a good question. So our colleague Julie Erickson is online with us, kind of in the background here. Julie, could you take that question and post it to our staff and our affiliates, and also then we'll share the responses on the follow-up to this meeting. So I'm happy to give my responses, but I'm guessing my colleagues have better signals than I do. I guess what I would say about this is that the key is to look for common values that you might have that could help you grow trust. So typically, trust comes from common beliefs or common context, or basically things we have in common. And you start from those. It's one of the principles of conflict resolution, is to first find what you have in common. So if you're going to be meeting in a virtual community, the first question I'd ask is, what does that community have in common? And figure out what those commonalities are, and then test those and share those, and try to build that into the early stage of your conversations. The second thing I'd say is there's some beautiful research that David Sibit and Alan Drexler did called the team performance model. And that says that when teams get together, whatever they are and however they meet, the first thing they do is orientation and trust building. That's what we all have to do. And they break down what the ways of doing that are. And we did work with David to overlay the matrix that I showed you earlier, the time-place matrix, with the team performance model. And it's very clear that orientation, trust building, and renewal, those are best done face-to-face. And when you can't do them face-to-face, that's when you have to look for what you have in common. And then you have to build on what you have in common and build that with very good facilitation. The other thing I'd mention here is Casper ter Kuile just published a new book. I just got the message this morning about the new sacred meeting spaces, and we'll put the link to this on too. And what Casper and his team from Harvard Divinity School have been studying is what are the new ways of providing meaning. And meaning helps to build trust. So if you look at all those new models, I talk about some of them in the last chapter of Full Spectrum Meeting on broader spectrums of meaning, a new game of hope. And as we look at those, all those different methods, and Casper's got a wonderful array of those with Angie Thurston and Sue Phillips, their colleagues. They've done a really nice job of looking at all the things that are happening now. Now, a lot of those things are in person. Their dinners and their meetings like that, which we can't do right now. So it's a really interesting question. How do you do that virtually? And the beginning of how you do that virtually is you find what you have in common and you build from that.
That's great. I think that this is a good time to wrap up this conversation. Bob, this has been fantastic talking to you. People who have been listening to this can watch the video again and look at all of the show notes and the links and everything by going to iftf.org/online collaboration series. And you will also be able to see about all of our upcoming video chats that we're going to have, including one that will be coming up soon with Jacques Vallée, which I'm really excited about. Bob, as he mentioned, worked with Jacques on a lot of this work at IFTF in the 70s. And Bob, do you have any closing words?
Well, I think it's wonderful to have Jacques coming up next because he's a wonderful bridge between Howard and me. Because Howard studied virtual communities, and he also coined the term smart mob organizing, which I love, which is that community organizing through virtual media. And when I was in graduate school, the great community organizer was Saul Alinsky, and he was the one who created this notion of how to community organize. So far, I don't think we've had the Saul Alinsky of cyberspace. The person who can do community organizing. We've had hints of it, and we have some people better at it than others. But I think there's a next generation of prophets out there, not prophets in the monetary sense, but in the meaning sense, who are going to teach us how to do smart mob organizing for good. And also resist the smart mob organizing for bad side of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight, and that's the time we're in now is the time when that person or people will have their opportunity to show their stuff.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, Bob, once again, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure talking to you. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. And
thank you.
Please talk to us. Please come back next week. Okay, bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.